Welcome to Jammin' with Jason Mefford, a show where we discuss topics relevant to Chief Audit Executives and professionals in audit, risk, and compliance. We discuss the technical and soft skills needed to navigate the minefields of organizations. You hear best practices and practical advice for helping you advance your career, and we'll even talk about music, mindfulness, and psychology, because we can. So sit back and relax while you listen to the #1 podcast in the world for internal auditors, unscripted and unedited. Welcome to another edition of Jammin' with Jason, a podcast about internal audit and finding some of the practical ways that you can actually apply and run your internal audit department. Now, on this show, of course, we always talk about practical things, and I'm here to talk about the things that you need to hear, not necessarily the things that you want to hear, or even the things that other people are usually talking about. So what you're going to hear here are some different ideas, but again, they're practical ways to help you in running your internal audit department and your internal audit career. And today is no exception to that. One of the probably the most challenging things for chief audit executives is constantly having to justify, or what some people call right sizing, the amount of resources used in internal audit. And so what this means is each year the chief audit executive has to kind of justify the number of people and the budget that they are using with senior executives and the board. Now, one of the most common ways for people to be able to do that is benchmarking. And today, what we're going to talk about, I'm going to share with you that benchmarking is really barking up the wrong tree. It has some serious flaws with it from a kind of an assumption perspective. And we're going to get in and talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to provide you also with some kind of tips and a little bit of an outline for you that you can go through and try to think about whether your internal audit department is actually right-sized. Now, why am I talking about this? Because this, like I said, is one of the most common things that chief audit executives struggle with. I talk with chief audit executives all the time about this. And in fact, you know, as when I was a chief audit executive, had to go through this process as well, and found it, again, to be one of the most challenging things that I had to do. Now, let's get in and talk a little bit about this. And the reason, again, for this is not only do I talk to people about it, but I've actually read a few articles recently that are advocating benchmarking. And like I said, benchmarking is like barking up the wrong tree because there's some serious flaws with that logic. And to help you kind of explain this, let me share with you a couple of examples or analogies that go along with this. Now, I don't know if, you know, when you were younger, if you were like me, but, you know, when kids in the neighborhood would get a new toy, they would get, you know, new clothes, maybe the most recent fashion had come out, and it's like, oh, you know, I need that pair of pants. When you would go back to your parents and kind of use this logic, tell me how well this worked for you, and you can kind of guess how well it worked for me. You know, Mom and Dad, Johnny down the street just got this new toy. And it's a cool toy, and all of the kids in the neighborhood have it, and so I need to have it as well. Or, hey, you know, Johnny just got this new pair of pants. They're the coolest thing. Everybody's wearing them. I need to get a pair of those pants too. And if you had similar experiences as I did, right, my parents did not buy me that toy or buy me that pair of pants just because everyone else was doing it. So one of the problems with benchmarking is that it's just a comparison of you against other people. And sometimes comparisons are good, but there is a serious psychological comparison trap that we can get into. And so again, just because somebody else is doing it or not doing it does not mean that is right for us. Now, let me use another example. Let's pretend, again, that I need to purchase a new automobile. And so there's different ways that I can go about trying to determine the appropriate automobile for me. And so let's, again, if we go back to kind of a benchmarking idea, we could say, okay, well, based on my family size, maybe my age, where I live, we could benchmark and determine that the average car or vehicle used in my particular area with the number of people in my family and, kind of where I live would equate to this particular automobile, and I should only spend, let's say, $35,000 or $40,000 on a vehicle, and it should probably meet these particular characteristics. Now, that's, again, if I just compare and benchmark with what everyone else is doing. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is it actually doesn't take into account my particular needs, desires, or the objectives that I may have. So as an example, let's pretend that I go through that whole benchmarking study and I find out that the average, for my demographic, I should purchase a Toyota Camry because that just happens to be what everybody else is doing. And I'm not, it could be any other car. I'm just naming one because one of my friends has a Toyota Camry, okay? Now, if I look at that and say, well, everybody else says, based on benchmarking that I should purchase a Toyota Camry. The problem is a Toyota Camry does not do what I need it to do necessarily, right? And so I have to go back and actually look at my objectives. I have to look at my lifestyle, how much I drive, the kind of driving I do, maybe the kind of recreational activities that I do, and try to come up with, based on that, the best options for me that are within my budget. And so, as I told you, I like to go hiking and go out into the mountains and do some of these other things as well. And so because of that Toyota Camry may not be the best option for what I need to accomplish. And so again, if you're just using a benchmark or just trying to do what other people are doing, it's not necessarily going to fit into what it is that you need to do. Because really, when you're trying to figure out the appropriate size for the internal audit department, it's got to be based on a lot of other things besides what others are doing. So you need to be considering things like, the mission of your function. What is it that your charter is actually asking you to do? What are some of the risks and expectations that go on in your organization to be able to determine what should be on your audit plan? How much, and which of those items should you actually be looking at? What's the staffing that you need in order to be able to do that? There's a whole lot of other things that are there that you need to consider. And we're going to go through and talk a little bit about that here. Now, because this is a podcast, it's a shorter format episode, I really can't provide you with everything, but I'm going to try to give you some tips to start thinking about. And for those of you that are actually, this is something that you're living and breathing, if you would like more information, reach out to me because I'm happy to have a short call with you and just kind of talk about some of the things specific to your organization and help you to be able to find a solution to this challenge. Now, if we go back to benchmarking and kind of think about why so many people try to do this, I'm going to be, again, completely honest with you. At the beginning of my career, I was guilty of doing this. And let me explain maybe sometimes why people choose to take this kind of simple way of trying to determine, the resources that they should use. Because what ends up happening often is, as a chief audit executive, you go to the audit committee and you have the meeting with them, and at the end, you have an executive session. where at that point they look at you and they say, so Jason, do you feel like you have the resources that you need to be able to do your job? Well, when they ask kind of that kind of a question, a lot of times it's like, well, no, because I could use more resources, right? And so when you start going down that path, then the next logical question they're going to ask is, well, how many more resources do you need, or what else do you need? And at that point, if you haven't really done an evaluation to know for sure what it is that you need, you're kind of stuck with just coming up with a number, or going back to that comparison trap where you say, well, based on the size of the organization that we really should have 8 people in our department and we only have 4. So I need 4 more people because everybody else that's kind of in my area, in our kind of business, would normally run an internal audit department off of 8 people. Now, at that point, when you stop, they're probably not going to give you 4 more people and double the size of your audit shop. And so again, if we go back to that analogy before of me going to my parents and saying, hey, Johnny has a new toy, I want one too, you're going to get the same kind of response from the audit committee. Well, that's nice that the other companies are doing this. I don't know if we can afford that or if we want to spend that much on it. And so usually you're kind of shot down. Now, again, like I said, I was guilty of that at the beginning of my career as well, because it's really easy to say that, right? And to go out and purchase benchmarking studies and do some other stuff. And there's great information in a lot of the articles out there about how to benchmark, so that you can come up with and kind of common size and figure out, how you're different than some of the other companies to come up with some number. But like I said, again, the problem is that doesn't take into account what your organization may need from a risk perspective and from an expectation perspective of the board and of senior management as well. So benchmarking, probably barking up the wrong tree. And so, like I said, it can become a slippery slope when you start to do that, because again, there's not kind of the value attached with or associated with what you're actually doing. You're just benchmarking off of the averages of everybody else. So what happens then when the average goes down, as everybody else starts cutting their audit departments, your audit department gets cut as well. Okay. And so, like I said, there's better ways to go through and think about this. So let's go through now and actually kind of talk about some of the questions or things that you should consider, maybe a better way for you to do this that's actually more sustainable and that helps you so that you don't have to constantly justify every single year how many people you should have. Now, one of the things that you need to consider is the type of organization that you're working for. And so I'm just going to give you, again, kind of some basic guidance here. But for example, if you work for a publicly traded company, your audit staff is probably going to be bigger than if you work for a privately held company, because there are some additional requirements and expectations from the board and also from regulators on what a publicly traded company's internal audit department looks like than a privately held company. So ask yourself that question. Another one, are we in a regulated industry, or is this not a very regulated industry? So the more regulated your industry, again, the more expectations from your board and from outside stakeholders that you're going to have a larger internal audit department. So if you're privately held, relatively low regulation, you're always going to have a smaller staff and smaller resources to deal with than if you're in a publicly traded, highly regulated industry. Now, another thing for you to consider is kind of the governance structure within the organization. How does governance work in your organization, from the board down as well into some of the first, second, and third line of defense sort of positions that are in your organization? And so again, if you have a lot of second line of defense functions that are doing a lot of that work with the first line group, the audit department of that company may be smaller, right? Because you're considering now the total assurance in the organization, some of which may be done by the second group versus internal audit. That's another thing that you need to kind of figure out. So what is kind of the governance structure that we have going on there? You should also take a look at your charter, right? And so the charter is kind of the agreement or expectations from the board and from senior management on what internal audit will do at your particular organization. So you need to be clear about understanding exactly what it is that they want you to do. Now, here's another thing that I will tell you. If the activities they're expecting of you are lower value activities, and so what I mean by a lower value activity can be things like checkbox compliance testing. That is going to have a much lower value to the organization than some true risk-based strategic level projects that you would be working on with management. And so again, if the expectation is you're going to spend more of your time doing checkbox compliance, you're going to get fewer resources than if they see you as a valuable contributor and are asking you to be involved in some of the strategic and higher risk issues within the organization. So those are some things for you to consider. Now, next, you want to take a look at, well, what are actually the risks and expectations of the organization? And so again, as you've gone through either the risk assessment that you've done to help create the audit plan, or look at the risk assessment done by your company or in conjunction with your company, look at what those risks are in the organization. You want to develop your audit plan based on the highest risks or those things that have the most impact to the organization. And everything on your audit plan should actually tie back to that, plus any compliance expectations that you may have from a regulatory standpoint. And so what I mean from that is, for example, a lot of times in financial services, especially in banking, some of the banking regulators may require you to do branch audits, a certain number of branch audits every single year. Now, that may not be the highest risk to the organization, but if the regulator is requiring it, someone has to do it. And so some of those things will also be included in your audit plan. But again, from an expectation perspective, what is it that the board and what is it that senior management is expecting you to do? Because again, that is going to have a direct relationship back to the level of resources that they're willing to allocate to internal audit. So as you go through, and what I like to do is, as you're creating the audit plan, is you're actually assessing the different levels of risk and trying to associate the audit projects that you're working on with those particular risks. And so the idea would be is you can actually go through, and there's methodologies for kind of calculating which projects have the biggest impact on the organization. And then if you sort your audit plan with the biggest, highest, most important things at the top, and then filter down, now what you can do is when you go back and look at the amount of resources that you need to do each of those projects, you can start to get an idea based on your current staffing and resources, how many of those projects that you can do. And so I think a better way of doing it is that sort of a sorting, and then you draw a line. And the line means, audit committee and senior management, this is all the resources that I have with my current staffing. So I'm just making up some numbers here to try to make it easy for you here as we're listening. But let's say that you have 30 items on your audit plan. But when you sort them, you realize you only have resources for the top 10. And so you sort that out, you draw the line under the 10th one, and then when you have the discussions with the audit committee and with senior management, you can say, based on our current staffing, these are all the things we can do this next year. If you would like other things below that to be tested as well, Now we can start to have an intelligent discussion about how many more resources that you need, right? Because if they look at it and say, well, we don't want you to just do the top 10, we want you to do the top 15. If you've gone through that exercise, now you can determine how many more resources would I need to complete those other 5 projects. Those could be internal resources that you hire new people. It could be outsourced, other things like that that you can do. But now at least you can have an intelligent discussion, which is different than Johnny just got a new toy, right? It's if you want me to do these other 5 things, it's going to require 10,000 hours of work, right? And so that equates to maybe 5 or 6 new people that you would need to hire as an example. That's going to get you a lot further than just doing the equivalent of Johnny just got a new toy from a benchmarking perspective. So again, as you've created the audit plan, you've sorted it based on the biggest impact to the organization. You've determined how much time you think it's going to take you to do each of those projects. And then you can determine, again, based on your current level of staffing, your current budget, how many of those you would be able to do this next year. And then again, you can have that discussion on that. Now, another thing to think about too is, a lot of people in the profession talk about adding value. We've got to add value. What's our value add? Well, if you're gonna talk in terms like that, you also need to start creating a list of the value that you have already contributed to the organization. Because really, even though most people see internal audit as a cost center, we need to be thinking of internal audit as an investment center. No different than any other investment center type of department in your organization. If the board and senior management is entrusting you with $2 million budget, you better get a return on that $2 million budget. And so again, as you're going through the year, you're doing the projects, you're seeing the savings or risk avoidance to the organization, start keeping track of that list. Because again, at the end of the year, when you're going back and asking for more budget or looking at your resources for next year, then you can confidently say, look, you entrusted me with $2 million worth of resources. And during this year, we provided $10 million of value to the organization. If I'm on the board or I'm a senior manager and I look at that and say, yep, that looks good. The analysis that you did, that makes a lot of sense. We invested $2 million and we got $10 million return on that. That's 5 times. That's a pretty good return on investment. And so again, as you can start to actually track that and be able to show the value that you're providing to the organization, that's going to make it much, much easier for you in the future as, again, you're trying to determine what's the right size of our internal audit. And again, if you think about it as an investment center, if they've invested $2 million in you and you've gotten a $5 million or $10 million return, if you ask for another $1 million and can return another $5 million in value, you're going to be much more likely to actually have that additional $1 million in investment approved. And so again, don't think of yourself as a cost center. Think of yourself as an investment center and start actually keeping track of the value that you are actually providing. Now, we don't have enough time in this episode to get into all of that, so I'll have to do that on a future episode. But there are ways for you to be able to start calculating the value that you are providing to the organization. And I know sometimes that's in cost avoidance, but there are ways to do that. And the more that you can actually do that, the more valuable you will be seen to the organization as well. And you can move from their expectation or their view of you of just being a cost center to actually being an investment center that is actually providing a return and a true value to the organization. So that's probably a good place for us to wrap up for today. But again, as you're trying to think about and determine the right amount of resources that you need in your internal audit group, or doing kind of a right sizing approach, don't rely on benchmarking to be able to try to do that. Instead, think about your organization, the governance structure that you have, who else is providing some of these services, what are some of the expectations, again, from your charter and the mission of your department, thinking about the risks to the organization and the expectations of senior management and the board, developing an audit plan that truly is risk-based so that when you sort it, you can determine exactly how many of those risks you can address based on the resources that you have. So that way you can go back and have a more intelligent conversation if you need more resources, or if the board and senior management choose to give you more resources. The other thing that I didn't talk about before is sometimes when you have those discussions, they may look at it and say, yep, nope, the 10 is probably all that we need to do. We're okay with that. Well, at that point, don't go trying to fight for more resources. Because again, if your bosses, i.e. the board and senior management, have already told you they're comfortable with that level of risk, then that's what we need to be comfortable with as well. So go forth and continue rocking in the audit world, and we'll see you on a future episode of Jammin' with Jason. Have a great rest of your day. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Jamming with Jason. Keep on rocking in the audit world. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you later on the next show. If you'd like to earn continuing professional education for listening to today's episode, head on over to C-Risk Academy at ondemand.criskacademy.com. And that's C as in the letter C, riskacademy.com. Not only do you get a CPE certificate, but you also will have access to the video version of today's show. The views and opinions expressed on this show are that of the individuals and not of their respective organizations.